and advanced management with a focus on gender diversity and inclusion. She's currently the Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation at the Global Foodbanking Network, leading climate strategy, which includes food loss and waste prevention, methane mitigation, and climate adaptation from a nutrition lens.
Buenos días. Good morning from Colombia. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that we are going to have a fantastic panel.
Awesome. And finally, we have Wanjiku Kiarie from Busara. And Wanjiku is a senior associate in project delivery. She's keen to enhance food security through data-driven strategies in rural and hard-to-reach areas. This entails working with the most vulnerable communities and empowering them for better health through quality, nutrition, and responsible and sustainable utilization of resources.
Hi, everyone. Looking forward to learning together.
Yeah. So that's the team we have for this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So without taking too much time, let's just jump right in. And we're going to start with a simple poll. And so at this point, there'll be a poll coming up on your screen. Please feel free to answer it. And the question is, what are the major causes of food waste in your markets? So we know that the causes of food waste are diverse, but we also know that they're very context specific, which is to say that the food waste in the global north is different from the food waste in the global south, and even it's different across different markets. And we're looking to really understand like what affects different markets. And this is part of what we're going to discuss today. And so if we go to the next slide, we could start with our first question. And the first session of questions are going to be 4 questions per each session. Is going to lead us to understanding the scope of food waste in traditional markets, solutions, businesses and sustainable practice models. And I'm going to start with a simple question for Wanjiku. And the question is, what behavioral or perceptual shifts among vendors or consumers have potential to effectively unlock new economic value from imperfect produce in African markets? And maybe you could share some insights or some examples when these insights created tangible business opportunities.
Thank you, Michael. So food waste, particularly for cosmetic standards, is often framed as a story of loss. However, research in African markets shows that behavioral insights can reframe these narratives into one of opportunity. By shifting how vendors and consumers perceive imperfect produce, we can unlock real economic value with even small changes. So the good news is perceptions are changing and we have seen promising strategies. We tested light touch, low-cost interventions rooted in behavioral science and saw immediate results. So we worked around framing, where vendors who used signs with positive framing, like tasty and affordable or same taste, lower price, sold more imperfect produce, and consumers are more receptive than assumed. The interventions revealed a disconnect between vendors, what the vendors assumed, and the actual attitudes of consumers. Many vendors believed customers wouldn't accept imperfect produce, but our report showed that when framed positively, like using words like funny looking but nutritious or funny looking but equally tasty, consumers were surprisingly willing to buy. The other thing was sampling of produce. And this is very common even if you now go to the market or to the supermarkets, you'll see consumers are allowed to taste like fruit. And this helps remove that bias, where even if it has a bruise, the sweet bites helps convince the consumer to go ahead and purchase. Then there's social proof. When vendors saw other successful selling imperfect produce, the barrier of being the first dropped drastically. So these weren't expensive campaigns, they were small nudges that made big differences. Now, when you think of success stories and what we have seen, vendors are displaying imperfect produce more prominently now without hiding them like they could have done before, especially in Nigeria, using sign and separate baskets for funny looking produce rather than mixing them with the standard produce helped improve their sales, while in Kenya, mixing them with increased sales, mixing this imperfect produce with imperfect produce with perfect produce increased their sales. Vendors reported that customers began returning specifically for the imperfect produce once they recognized its value and quality. Strategic pricing to attract bargain items. So some of the consumers want to buy produce at a lower price. So having that discounted price by offering them in a tiered way, offer slightly discounting prices for imperfect items, found that this did not undercut sales of the standard stock. Instead, it attracted a new level of customers who wanted something discounted. So this, for example, having 3 imperfect tomatoes and for the price of 2 regular or perfect tomatoes. So the most powerful data came from the behavioral experiments that we did using treatment and control markets. Consumers in treatment markets where framing strategies were used, e.g. funny looking is just as nutritious, showed 22% higher willingness to pay for imperfect produce compared to control markets. Our campaigns and messaging successfully enhanced acceptance and willingness to pay for funny looking carrots in both Kenya and Nigeria treatment markets, with a preference for chopped carrots mixed with peas for value addition as something else apart from what you would have just sold as carrots with 2 forks. Behavioral insights show us that sometimes the barrier isn't the product itself, it's the perception. And by shifting that, even slightly, we can unlock new value streams, especially for small vendors. The real win is when food waste reduction becomes not just sustainable, but profitable.
That's really good. And just as a follow-up, how did vendors respond to this research? How did they respond to this research on like funny looking produce?
So initially, vendors were not open to selling this produce, and in fact, they believe that consumers themselves, from their end, they'll have the belief of, if I show this, my consumers will have a negative thinking of me and see that I'm not as displaying or offering what the rest of my other vendors are offering. So it's a reputation risk for me. So some of them, they ended up not wanting to display, and they would hide their produce. And this meant that it could be them ending up losing what they had. That means that if you're selling your produce and others are displaying something much better, consumers would be attracted to that. And even from the consumer side, especially in Nigeria, they thought that, especially men, if you buy produce that are imperfect, you don't really care about your family members.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. And that's very interesting. I feel like we could talk about that for long, but we do have a lot to cover. So I'm going to move on to a question on the same topic, but now to Stella, which is what structural challenges such as infrastructure, logistics, and regulations contribute towards food waste at traditional markets? And what role do structural improvements play in reducing food waste? How can they be scaled?
Sure. Thanks very much for the question. And first, just to emphasize what we probably already all know on this call, which is just how important traditional markets are, right? In many low and middle income countries, it's 70, 80, 90% of the population that is getting their food from traditional markets. So it's an important source of nutrition and food security, but also livelihoods and economic growth. And because they do handle such a large amount of food, even relatively small amounts of waste in percentage terms will add up to large amounts in terms of quantities. But we do see that there are a number of features of traditional markets and the supply chains leading up to them that do tend to lead to food waste. That arises due to spoilage, due to contamination, leading to food safety issues, damage or poor quality that arises through the value chain, and also the problem of excess supply in the market relative to the demand that's available there. As I mentioned, this is not just a problem at the market itself, but it reflects challenges that have occurred all the way through the value chain. So, for example, having poor quality storage and transport along the value chain can lead to damage, which can increase the speed at which food spoils, and can also introduce contaminants that make the food unsafe and mean that it needs to be disposed of. Having poor quality infrastructure like roads and trucks exacerbates this. Regulations can also play a role if you have onerous checkpoints and insufficient personnel to move fresh produce quickly through those. You can lead to faster spoilage rates before it even gets to the market. And then there's also questions of what are the skills and the motivations and incentives of the different value chain actors to really make sure that food keeps its quality as it moves through the value chain. But once we actually get to the market, we see that there is often a lack of cold storage for things like fresh fruits and vegetables, animal source foods like meat and dairy, a lack of shade and cover so that food can be easily exposed to dust and to sun that makes it spoil more quickly or introduces those contaminants, lack of appropriate surfaces, so surfaces that are kind of rough and can easily damage it to be contaminated. There's challenges with water. There not being enough water, particularly clean, potable, piped water in markets to be able to clean products and reduce the risk of contamination, but sometimes also too much water. A lot of these traditional markets don't have good drainage. So when there's rain, a rainstorm like that, you end up with a lot of mud, a lot of standing water that again can increase contamination and spoilage. And then finally, there's challenges with there not being enough information and information systems that can provide data on supply and demand, so that those who are selling produce know where to take it and those who are buying know where to seek it to try and avoid that mismatch at the market level that can lead to excess supply. So in short, we do need investments in basic infrastructure all along the value chain, like electricity, roads, but we also need specific infrastructure like cold storage, drainage, improved market surfaces. And in order to scale this, the important thing to keep in mind is that it's not about getting it perfect, but it's about finding the right fit for a given context that will be able to balance appropriate technology for that context that is needed to bring down the risks of spoilage and wastage, but without leading to an excessive price that makes it too difficult to scale with limited resources.
That's super interesting. And from what I'm hearing from you, the solution, many people would like to think, it's easy to think that this is just a policy thing, but from what I'm hearing from you, the solution has to be like involve all actors from all stakeholders, and they need to work together. Is that accurate?
Definitely. I mean, policy plays an important role, but on itself will not solve the problem. And I'd say that really policies, as well as other interventions, need to focus on the key actors in these markets. So informal vendors who are often not involved in these types of policy consultations, and also the consumers that are regularly frequenting these markets to purchase.
Awesome. Yeah. And so now, just to keep us moving, let's move on to a question for Anna Catalina, and it's how can food redistribution efforts be better integrated into traditional market systems, and what are some successful models from various regions?
Michael, thank you very much. Let me just start. If you can help me, we can start by we want to nourish people and the planet together. And this is the interconnection between food loss and waste and hunger. And Estela, thank you very much for raising the topic about the importance of nutrition when we are speaking about food loss and waste. And I would like to start by that. Let me just start by introducing the Global Foodbanking Network, that is an organization that is focused on the goal to nourish people and the planet together. We share knowledge, unlock partnerships, and provide catalytic funding to our food banks in field in the regions. With the help of partners, we are working to increase food access for 50 million people facing hunger by 2030. Then I hope that everyone is going to join us in this amazing purpose. In the next slide, we are going to see that the majority of the work that we are doing right now is in the Global South. We are in in Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific, with some countries in the global north too. And in the next slide, you can see that we are mixing our impact it's a mix between two key elements. At the same time that we are losing or wasting the third part of the total food that was produced for human consumption, around 3 billion people is facing problems to access to food that is helping them to have a better life. Then GFN in 2023 served 41 million people with the food banks that we represent. We redistributed 600 million kilograms of food that in other case communities could not access to those. And we prevent 1.8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Then there is a mix it's a win-win perspective when we are preventing food loss and waste. We are serving people and we are preventing emissions. In the next slide, please, the theory of change that we want to put here on the table, and we are speaking about markets, is where the food losses and waste is occurring. And when we are in the climate space, when we are speaking about food waste, then we are preventing from the transport, storage, distribution from the agriculture sectors, from processing and packaging, retail, public household and consumption. And what's very interesting when Jacob was mentioning some of the hot spots where we are having those food waste in general and food losses and waste from the food loss and waste conversation. In the next slide, this is one of the main findings is food recovery and redistribution of food donation is among the most environmental preferable pathway to prevent food loss and waste. And this is huge because preventing, as Stella was mentioning, with all the key elements that we need to activate to prevent food loss and waste, preventing by sectors and in source is the most important part. And after that, food donation is the second most environmental preferable pathway. In the next slide, just to end with the next three is why we want to keep the food inside the food loss and waste, inside the supply chain. It's because when we prevent food loss and waste, when we do donation or redistribution of surplus, we are keeping the nutritional density of the food that was produced for human consumption. And that is the main element that we cannot have the amount of numbers of hunger and people facing hunger or difficulties to access to food when at the same time we are losing or wasting food. Then we want to keep as much nutritional density inside the supply chain. In the last one, slide, sorry. Just to finalize here, then what we believe definitely is the importance to keep the majority of the food that we can do in the supply chain. We are working in 15 countries in Africa. We have South Africa Food Bank, Cote d'Ivoire Food Bank, Kenya Food Bank, that they are preventing food loss and waste from markets, from the agriculture sector, and working, of course, with retailers and the hospitality sector. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up, I know there are multiple barriers to this, but what would be the key barrier to food redistribution? Why isn't it currently happening?
Michael, thank you. One of the key things that we found is food donation has been people is not seeing food donation as one of the key elements to prevent food loss and waste. And this is with the new findings from the environmental agency in the United States, from the European Commission in the food loss and waste table is the confirmation that prevention is the most important action to prevent food loss and waste. Then I think food donation was seen as something like not a structural change. Then now with the new findings, we are confirming that food donation after reduction in source is the second most important action. Then I think that is going to change the perspective about why investing in food banks, investing in food recovery and redistribution is a key element to prevent food loss and waste.
That's super interesting. Thank you so much for that. And still in this first kind of block of questions, I'd like to switch over quickly to Fernanda. And Fernanda, you've supported a study in street markets that revealed key regional differences in food waste behaviors for animal feed use in the north, composting in the south. As you now develop strategies aligned with Brazil's legal framework on organic waste, could you share one key insight that surprised you and changed your approach?
Yes, thank you, Michael, for the question, and thank you again for the invite. It's really good to be here with you today. Yes, we conducted this study 2 years ago in 3 different cities in the country, one in the south, one in the northeast, and one in the north of the country. And we found out different perspectives on the food waste in each of the street markets that we worked with. And I can say that one of the key insights that we had from the waste characterization that we conducted was for sure the volume and the regularity of food grade organic waste being diverted informally for animal feed, especially in the north of the country. So while we were expecting some degree of reuse, we found out that this practice is systematic and culturally embedded in certain regions, as I said, especially in the north of the country. When we went to the south, they don't have this practice, so they send most of the food for the composting facility, for example. This insight guided our recommendation in two important ways. So one, the cities can incorporate those solutions that go beyond conventional waste treatment options, but adopt solutions that are community-driven circular practices. But at the same time, it raised concerns about the regulatory gaps and public health risks. So, for instance, in this region, the north region of the country, we observed significant amount of organic waste being used for feed pigs in informal settings. Without any sanitary control or legal framework. And this is the main barrier that we have in the country when it comes to animal feed. We don't have this legal framework. So based on this, we have recommended that local authorities not only invest in infrastructure like composting, so when we have the waste that we can prevent, we should send it to the recycling facilities and not to final disposal, as we still have in the country as one of the main destinations that are the dump sites. But we should consider governance tools to monitor and to guide such informal flows. We definitely need that. Recognizing and integrating these practices that we consider, as Catalina was showing, we consider as valorization of the waste. So we could help develop more context sensitive, inclusive, and strategies for organic management in line with Brazil's legal framework. And one final comment is, as you said, Michael, we are developing right now in Brazil. UNEP is supporting the government on the development of its reduction and recycling of organic waste national plan. And one of the recommendations that we bring in the plan that is almost to be launched, its final version, is to consider this kind of solutions, not only the waste management, but also to consider the legal framework required to expand this kind of alternatives. So.
Yeah, that's really insightful stuff. And just as a short follow-up is like, so the legal framework and bringing the government into it is one bit. What would you think would be some things we could do to ensure compliance with that legal framework? Because you said that this challenge is a bit systemic and it's embedded in the culture. So what do you think could be some things we could do to ensure compliance and that people actually adhere to this legal framework?
Yes, definitely. What we have now are individual practices for each of the managers of the street markets that we have. And for sure, we should have, when it comes to this kind of practices, we should have the involvement of the municipality that now doesn't have any kind of control on that. They are supposed to manage the waste management systems, but when it comes to diverting this waste for animal feed, for example, we don't have it at all. So we should develop the legal framework in the local context as well, and then the municipality should be able to guide the farmers that are working in those street markets to comply with this law, and technical trainings, capacity buildings are key for that for sure, as we are still already seeing some of the initiatives.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And just one more question in this first block of questions before we move on to the next block, and this is back to Wanjiku, which is based on your research, what are the main drivers of food waste due to aesthetic standards, and how does it impact market vendors?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I think we are all here because we have seen, or we are aware that about 1/3 of the food produced globally ends up being wasted, while we are aware that millions are hungry, not forgetting the environmental and economic impact. While food loss and waste is happening at different stages of the supply chain, at retail point, aesthetic standards, when we are purchasing as consumers, is a big issue in traditional markets, resulting to waste of perfectly nutritious food. So what is driving this exactly? So there's consumer preferences. Mostly, probably you and myself will want to go for the best looking produce, which is smooth, ripe, and undamaged. But this is stemming from decades of marketing and retail norms, where shoppers often equate perfect looking produce with quality. The idea of us wanting to go for what is best looking leads to wastage of what is perfectly and equally nutritious. Then there's vendors sorting and displaying. Vendors want to grade their produce. There's a higher grade produce and a lower grade produce. And this ends up having them displaying the good looking first and sort of hiding the others. And this is very common in traditional markets as a way to attract consumers, but also to remain competitive. It also helps attract consumers who are willing to pay for what is aesthetically pleasing. But what we saw in our research is that many vendors are actually unwilling to display this produce and even sell, but they are still being sold in one way or the other because they are consumers who are willing to pay for what is discounted, even if it's imperfect. But the other driver here is inadequate market linkages. I think this is something that Anna Catalina has talked about. And here is where, as a vendor, you don't have connections or you don't know how to access processors, for example, or buyers, or those who are supporting food redistribution or can change that which is imperfect into another product. So this lack of or inadequate linkages leads to a situation where vendors have no incentives to rescue or repurpose the imperfect stock. And these have the implication of the vendors themselves going into losses. The bias against imperfect produce creates an indirect economic burden to them. So wasted stock, which they bought and brought to their stalls, and now there are no sales for that. And one thing we also saw in our research is that almost all vendors are making losses from unsold imperfect produce. And you know what? They are aware of the losses they are making out of it. Then now there's the issue of reputation. You fear of you being known for offering what is of low quality, and there is the pressure of everyone keep up this standard. But we saw that vendors were reporting that consumers are motivated with discounts. And this is why, going back to what I talked about before, some of the behavioral elements we tackled was through framing the messaging, making sure that consumers are seeing this as funny looking but nutritious, funny looking but good, equally tasty. We talked about sampling of produce, helping them taste out and feel it's actually the same. And then the element of social proof. But I think what I'm also picking is that this discussion is going on is that more actors need to come together. It's not something that we can say vendors and consumers, for example, at the retail level will handle it all. We need to work with other actors that can support redistribution of this imperfect food, How do we go about donation of this imperfect food? How do we go about it from a policy level? So I think the discussion is quite interesting to listen to. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, thank you, Anjiko, and I agree on your final point that this is really going to take a lot of collaboration from multiple actors. There's no one actor in one space can fix the food waste issue on their own. Just a quick reminder that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll be taking questions and answers at the end of this next block of questions. And so now to move on to the second block of questions, which is if we could go to the next slide, which is unlocking economic and business opportunities from food waste prevention. And I'm going to start this block with a question for Anna Catalina, and it's, how can food redistribution efforts be better integrated into traditional markets? No, that's not the right question, sorry. The question is, food banks excel at creating value from surplus. Can you share a scalable model from your network where food rescued from traditional markets was redirected to generate social impact and economic returns? How can such models be adopted for formal markets?
Michael, thank you very much. And I think we have been responding to these questions, all of us together, about why food prevention is becoming more and more important, and the important role that our food banks are playing on the food prevention activities, and why it's relevant, as Fernanda was mentioning, and Wanjiko just said it, is the most important conversation that we need to do is how to keep all the food inside the supply chain to feed people. That is like the main focus. And if you ask me, if we leave this conversation with one thought, is that everyone from your houses, keeping the tomato, please eat the tomato. Us on the restaurants, if you are in a company, like how to ensure that the food that we are producing for human consumption is feeding people. That is the main goal of this conversation. If I need to choose a thought that you are going to keep in your mind for the next 8 days, is that one, like keep the food in the supply chain. Then food banks are playing an important role. And I'm starting by this because I just want, in the global scale, 59% of the total food that is recovered is from our food banks. That means was prevented to be lost or waste, is high nutritional value. What that means is fruit and vegetables, legumes, dairy food, protein, vegetable and leguminous, and animal protein. And in Africa, in the 15 countries where we are working, 76% of the total food that we are receiving as a food donation from the traditional markets are high nutritional value. That means it's food that is is improving the life of the people that we are serving. At the same time, we are doing our nutritional impact analysis, and just imagine that in snacks or a school, like a school meal program, and a snack school meal program is providing more or less 20% of the total calories or daily energy requirement that children needs for the day. Food banks in Africa are providing with the donations, with the food that we prevented to be lost or waste, is providing 5% of the total daily energy and nutritional requirements. That means that when we are doing food recovery and redistribution activities, we are making available food that in other way, other people, vulnerable people, were not accessing to that. Then I think food recovery and redistribution and food donation is supporting the food systems transformation and ensuring that the food systems transformation is not just a conversation about emissions, it's a conversation about nutrition too. Thank you, Michael.
I think we might have lost Michael at this point. Michael, are you back? that I think in the interest of time, I will have to step in for him because I'm privy of what we have. Thank you so much, Anna, for your response on what you're doing to rescue and make sure there's value. We see that you're contributing to at school level on the nutrition aspect by taking up those donations from the market. So moving on to, at this point, I want to move. Are you back, Michael? Yeah. So at this point, I want to move to Stella, if that's okay. So I think the question here is, Gain's work focuses on nutrition-sensitive food systems. What are some of the examples of how waste reduction and supporting nutrition can be mutually beneficial? What is needed to make these approaches viable for business?
Sure. And I think it builds really well on what Anna Catalina was saying, actually. Wasted food represents nutrients that aren't being eaten and that therefore cannot contribute to improving nutrition. And it also represents resources that were used to produce that food and move it all the way along the supply chain, like agricultural inputs, people's time, greenhouse gas emissions, different resources that were necessary for producing that food that are now essentially just being thrown out. And in the process of that, they're lowering the availability of food for consumers, and they can be often increasing the prices of that food for consumers. Lower availability and higher prices reduce access to food, hindering the opportunities for people to access that nutrition. So that's where there's a real win-win for reducing food waste while at the same time working to improve nutrition. And I think Ana Catalina gave some really great examples of kind of how food redistribution can be used to as a great way to kind of redirect that food towards people who can benefit from it. Also, maybe on a bit slightly different potential angle that's maybe a bit smaller, but also I think we think an interesting possibility to be looking into at Gain, and we can share in the chat paper that was recently published looking into this in more detail. But that's looking at where there is avoidable food waste that is highly nutritious and could be repurposed into nutritious foods. So a lot of things that we think of as waste and we currently just throw out intentionally as opposed to unintentionally, there's actually a lot of nutrition in there. And with the right kind of creativity, there are ways to repurpose that waste into nutritious foods. So to give you just a couple examples, eggshells. We always throw them out, right? We make an omelet, we throw out the shells again and again. They're actually super rich in calcium. And you can clean eggshells and make them into a powder and then add that to other foods like baked goods, cookies, muffins, bread, and increase the calcium content with almost no impact on the taste of the product or the safety of the product. So that's a great example of nutrition that's currently being thrown out, could be reclaimed, brought back onto our plates. Another example is fruit and vegetable peels and kind of other scraps from fruit and vegetables that we normally throw out. That we normally think of that as waste, but there's a ton of nutrients within that. It tends to taste similar to the rest of the fruit, even if it's not as pretty. And with the right processes for reclaiming that, cleaning that, and processing it, it can become another nutritious food product. And the good thing about using these type of waste products to make nutritious foods is that because it's waste, it's usually available very cheaply, which means that there's a potential for coming up with a highly affordable product that can be particularly important for people who are at risk of malnutrition. So what's needed to make that happen? First of all, we need to make sure there's consumer desirability, that there's an appropriate way to position and market these products that consumers will actually want to buy. Second, there needs to be appropriate technology, including to ensure safety and any processes or certifications on that where they're relevant. And then finally, it's important to understand the price points. Once you've done all of that processing and any packaging that needs to be taken into account, is there still a viable business model there that can deliver value for the company, but also provide these foods at an affordable point to the consumer?
Thank you so much, Stella. And I think there's an interesting tidbit of food there that most of us didn't know about. I didn't even imagine that the eggshells I'm throwing away were part of food waste. I'm like, do people use that? So I guess next time we'll be really we'll really be keen about making sure we use the eggshells as well, not just the inside yummy part of the egg. Um, And now we're going to move on to Fernanda. And Fernanda, the question is, in supporting design of a food waste public-private partnership in Brazil, UNEP and RAP identify challenges and opportunities for engaging retailers and building effective partnerships. What lessons from this experience show how food waste reduction can create environmental and social value? And how could these inform retail-focused initiatives in African countries?
Thank you, Michael. It's a great discussion today. I'm learning a lot. And well, sharing another experience that we had was the development of this PPP in Brazil that is now being developed by RAP with the support of UNEP. But through the development of this food waste PPP in Brazil, one of the clearest insights was the importance of collaboration across sectors. And I think that collaboration is one of our key words today, right? And Brazil's food waste context is really complex as well. So nearly 30% of food produced is wasted, while over 15% of the population faces severe food insecurity. So against this backdrop, UNEP and RAP worked with local stakeholders to design a framework that could drive those systemic changes while being tailored to the Brazilian context. And I think that a key takeaway was that reducing food waste is definitely not just about operational efficiency. It creates real environmental and social value. And one effective strategy was to engage those key actors in the supply chain, including the retailers where present, have the capacity and networks to be potential champions. So those actors, depending on the local context, they have the condition to support the redistribution efforts, improve the logistics, reduce losses, and their involvement can help influence practices across the chain. Another lesson was the need for a strong governance and local ownership. So the agreement proposes a national secretariat that we are right now convening and working groups to ensure multi-stakeholder coordination and accountability. And this structure helps define sub-targets and reflect national priorities, such as redistribution of surplus food, as Catalina was mentioning, and provides a clear value proposition to attract businesses. So I think that for African countries, the PPP model is particularly relevant. It offers a flexible approach that can adapt to local capacities, build trust among actors, and show measurable progress. A food loss and waste PPP was launched in South Africa and has been effective at connecting farmers and food businesses to reduce food waste systematically. So retailers across the region could benefit from similar models that bring together businesses, government, and also the civil society to address waste while also contributing to food security and climate action. Over.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And as everyone's been saying, we're learning a lot. Like maybe not anyone is learning everything, but everyone's making a little bit here and there that can really help them. But that's it for the questions we had set up. We're now going to go into a Q&A. And so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. But just as we begin, there's a question that was put in the chat I'm just scrolling around to look for it because I have a bunch of chats flying around, but it was by a person called Yusuf, Ahmad Yusuf, and she, I'm not sure, says in Pakistan, according to FAO, 26% of food is wasted annually for different reasons. What's the best way to reuse and repurpose wasted food? I'm going to start this one off with Ana Catalina because she talks a lot about repurposing, but any other panelists who want to answer this, please feel free.
Michael, thank you very much for the question. And of course, going back to what all my colleagues has been sharing, I would like to insist to keep the food in the supply chain. That means before to think how to manage the waste, we need to think how to prevent the waste. Then, of course, because has been the conversation all the time, waste management. We have waste management companies. We are speaking about waste management. If you go to the organic waste policies, everything is about how to manage the waste. Then the new seed that we want to put in your souls, in your hearts, and in your minds is how to prevent the waste, what we have to do. And I want to do a differentiation because people is speaking about banana peels. When we are speaking in general, we are speaking about the edible part of the food. Like, of course, the peels are relevant in some communities, in some countries and states. We are eating, in some cases, the peels, the potato peels, for example, is part of for example, we ate the total potato with the peel and the content, and it's the same with the banana. But in this case, we are speaking about the edible part of the food, the edible part of the animals and the fruit and vegetables, of course. Then the idea is to keep the food in the supply chain, ensure that you are using as much as you can. And after that, reuse is, again, in the circular economy approach, reuse the food is eating the food, like keeping the food to feed people, not to feed animals, not to do compost, not for bioindustrial uses. Say that if we want to recycle the food because we are doing some other type of foods because we couldn't achieve the first goal. There are many ways to do it. There are amazing examples like jams on the chat. Then I invite you to read the different things, and many people has been producing different recipes and work about that. But I would like to come back to something that Fernanda was mentioning about the ugly food movement that is becoming very important, has been on the market since I started in this food loss and waste space 15 years ago. It's about the role that the consumers are playing is very important in the countries where consumers are economic health. Because they are the ones that are deciding what to eat. It's an apple that is not bright, an apple that can be consumed? Yes, it is. It's the sizes, something, for example, we rescue many food in the agriculture sector because the size of the tomato or the size of the carrot or the size of the fruit is not sellable. People is not going to buy that size of products. Then we as a consumers play an important role in that way too.
Thank you so much. Keep the food in the supply chain. I like that. I really like that's a strong thing we should need to remember. We have two more questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists to keep it short because I know we're just a minute beyond time. And please, if you want to hear the answers, please stay with us. We'll answer these two questions and then we'll close. But the first question is from Lioba, and they ask, what infrastructural facilities have you provided or do you plan to provide in order to prevent post-harvest food waste? And I'd like to direct this question to Stella. Which I think would be best. So Stella?
Sure. I think I'm gonna broaden a bit beyond kind of what have we provided specifically. Gaines done a little bit of work in this space, but I think it's probably more interesting to look a bit more broadly because I think there are opportunities for infrastructure at all different levels that we think about infrastructure, right? Certainly things that are needed include major infrastructure like good roads that can move things along the supply chains, strong grids, etc. But there's also kind of a meso level of infrastructure that is smaller, cheaper, easier. So things like cold storage, including mobile cold storage facilities, right? So you can kind of have a truck that is refrigerated, can go straight to the farm, provide cold storage right on the farm, or go to the market, provide cold storage right there, can be solar powered, done off grid. Lots of great solutions on there. But there's also some bits of infrastructure that are super simple and really can be done with very little money, very little investment at a local level within traditional markets. So looking at things like just having basins in which to wash produce, having something like a plastic sheet to cover your surface, to cover the produce that you have there, having an improved surface or simple drainage, those kinds of really cheap, really simple, very flexible types of infrastructure investments are also important. So I think there's a whole ladder of opportunities in terms of scale and cost and complexity of infrastructure investments that can be made.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I want to give this up to anyone on the panel who wants to answer it, because I know we don't have a preservation expert here. But the question is food preservation through canning, drying, freezing a pathway used to reduce food waste? And how do you convince communities that prefer fresh food to consume preserved foods?
I think
I
I
can come in
can
on that one.
go.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Wanjiku,
Yeah,
You can
please.
go
Stella.
Wanjiku and Stella. Yeah.
Okay, great. So when I look at this, I see canning, drying, and freezing. You're taking the food, for example, when you're freezing, you're trying to preserve as much nutrition. And I think Stella will talk more about this. And when it comes to drying, the elements to it, canning, you are doing a bit of processing. So, and it is a way of reducing food waste. So, but your question then is, how do you convince communities that prefer fresh? So maybe the question here needs to be, do we want to convince those that are preferring fresh? Because in most cases, those that are preferring that have access to that food and nutrition. But then, can it reach those who could have missed out in accessing these nutrients by redirecting it? And even before you dry it and can it and freeze it, can it even go there fresh faster before adding more cost to it? But handing it over to Stella.
No, great points, Wanjiku, and I'll just build on them. I think these are great opportunities, particularly for that situation when supply exceeds demand, right? When you have a market that is flooded with too much of a given product, like mangoes at mango season, and they're everywhere, and nobody can eat that many mangoes, even if they're delicious. Having these types of preservation options is a really great way to smooth the supply throughout the year and avoid that type of food loss in particular. But I would question a little bit the question of, is it a preference barrier, right? Because I think what we actually see in a lot of places is that most of these preserved foods, they're too expensive right now and they're not that available. They're actually very convenient. And I think there are a lot of consumers, particularly in low and middle income countries, who would prefer to be able to use them more and to have more access to them. But currently, because of limited access to the technology and also particularly to the packaging, which for these foods tend to be a key driver of prices, these aren't generally that widely available in many of the markets that we're talking about. So I think there needs to be an intervention looking less at the consumer demand, but more at how do we get those available where they're needed at a price point that consumers who would benefit can actually pay.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a few more questions coming in, but I'm sorry, I just have to cut it off there because we're a bit over time and I want to respect everybody's time. But I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. And I hope you've clicked some of the links in the chat. You have the links to the LinkedIn for the panelists if you want to join them. On LinkedIn, we can have this conversation offline. We can have the conversation more and more in the future. And let's just keep working towards eliminating food waste. As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of food waste. There's a lot more food waste, but paradoxically, there's a lot more hunger. So it would be good to, like, if you can bring those two things together and solve a problem. So thank you so much for attending this. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to the people who came, who stayed all the way to the end. Have a wonderful rest of the day, wherever you are.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.